Alison Weir's The Princes in the Tower. Chapter 3. Richard of Gloucester. In May 1471, Henry VI was still a prisoner in the Tower of London, and it was here, according to the reliable contemporary chronicler, John Warkworth, that he was put to death, the 11th day of May, being a Tuesday night, between 11 and 12 of the clock, being then at the Tower the Duke of Gloucester, brother to King Edward, and many other. And on the morrow he was chested and brought to St. Paul's, and his face was open that every man might see him. And in his lying he bled on the pavement there. And afterwards, at the Blackfriars, was brought, and there he bled new and fresh. And from thence he was carried to Chertsey Abbey in a boat, and buried there in Our Lady's chapel. The murder of Henry VI was committed in strict secrecy, and it was given out officially by the government that upon learning of the death of his son and the capture of his wife, he had taken to so great despite, ire, and indignation, that of pure displeasure and melancholy he died. This fooled no one. A corpse that bled profusely on the pavement had not died of displeasure, as anyone could see. And that Henry VI died violently was borne out by the examination of his remains in 1910. The medical report in Archaeologia states that his skull was much broken, as if it had been crushed by a blow, and still had attached to it some hair, apparently matted with blood. There was both in 1910 and in 1471 little doubt in anyone's mind that Henry VI had been murdered. The Milanese ambassador in England informed the King of France almost at once that Edward IV had caused King Henry to be secretly assassinated at the Tower. He has, in short, chosen to crush the seed. Croyland, writing in 1486, says, with his usual reticence, "I shall say nothing about the discovery of King Henry's lifeless body in the Tower of London. May God have mercy upon and give time for repentance to him, whoever he might be, who dared to lay sacrilegious hands on the Lord's anointed. Let the doer merit the name of tyrant." Croyland's use of the word tyrant must mean that he is referring to a ruler, namely Edward IV, who had without doubt given the order for Henry VI's murder. But as the great chronicle states, the common fame went that the Duke of Gloucester was not altogether guiltless, and Warkworth's Significant mention of Gloucester's presence in the Tower on the night of the murder seems to imply that the Duke was somehow implicated. Otherwise, why mention him at all? Comines says that Gloucester killed this good man with his own hands, or at least had him killed in his presence, in some hidden, obscure place. Carmeliano, in 1486, made a similar accusation, and John Roos, writing before 1490, stated that Gloucester caused others to kill the holy man, or, as many think, did so by his own hand. Fabian has Gloucester stabbing Henry with a dagger, while Virgil says he killed him with a sword, whereby his brother might be delivered from all fear of hostility. And Moore says that Richard slew Henry VI without commandment or knowledge of the king. All these writers found it credible that Gloucester had been guilty of committing the murder. We should pause now to consider why people believed that this young duke was capable of regicide, and to trace his early life and the development of his character. Richard Plantagenet, youngest son of the Duke of York, was born on the 2nd October 1452 at Fotheringhay Castle. John Roos's hostile account of his life describes him as coming into the world after 2 years in his mother's womb, with teeth, long hair to his shoulders, a humped back, and his right shoulder higher than his left. Moore repeats these details, adding cautiously that either men of hatred report the truth, or else nature changed her course in this beginning. It is, of course, quite possible that Richard was born with teeth and long hair and deformities, and that there was some truth in what Roos and Moore wrote. But it seems likelier that over the years some embroidery had been added to the tale for dramatic effect. The new baby seems to have been a weakling. Richard liveth yet, recorded the anonymous annalist in the Chronicle of William of Worcester, with apparent surprise. However, Richard survived the perils of early childhood and seems to have spent his younger years in the company of his elder brother George, in the care of their mother at Fotheringhay. After Edward IV's accession in 1461, Richard was created Duke of Gloucester and sent to receive a knightly education in the household of the Earl of Warwick, which was based mainly at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. Here, Richard's companions included Warwick's daughters Isabella and Anne, and the Earl's ward, Francis Lovell, who would remain a lifelong friend. Here, too, Richard learned the arts of warfare and the skills required by a nobleman, as well as receiving some rudimentary training in law. During the 1460s, Edward IV did little for his youngest brother, heaping honors instead upon George, whom he had created Duke of Clarence and brought to court. But it was Richard who stayed loyal to the king when Warwick and Clarence turned traitor in 1469. Richard was then appointed Lord High Admiral of England, Chief Justice of the Welsh Marches, and Chief Constable of England, a post he had held briefly in childhood. He was also given other honours and offices in Wales and the Duchy of Lancaster. The following year, he replaced the disgraced Warwick as Chief Steward and Chamberlain of South Wales, thus becoming the chief's chief representative in the Principality. Later that year, Richard accompanied Edward IV into exile, and after Edward's restoration in 1471 was rewarded for his loyalty with yet more offices, replacing Warwick as Great Chamberlain of England and becoming Chief Steward of the Duchy of Lancaster. Richard was essentially the child of a violent age born to a legacy of civil war. His childhood and formative years were overshadowed by battles, treachery, and violent death. When he was 8, his father and his brother Edmund were killed in battle. He grew to maturity in an uncertain and insecure world, and twice suffered the agony of exile. He saw his brother the king betrayed by the other brother Clarence, and by Warwick, who had been as a father to Richard. It is therefore fair to say that by the age of 18 he had become hardened to violence and treachery, and had developed a ruthless streak in his character. Gloucester first saw battle himself at Barnet in 1471, where he acquitted himself while leading the vanguard of the royal forces, showing considerable ability in warfare, whilst in the thick of the fighting. He also fought brilliantly at Tewkesbury, for which he received yet more lands by way of reward. It was after Tewkesbury that Gloucester's ruthlessness first became apparent, when, as Constable of England, he exercised his right to sentence to summary execution, without trial or witnesses, the last Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and other Lancastrians, including one in holy orders who was entitled to immunity from the death penalty. These unfortunate men had been forcibly dragged from sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey on Gloucester's orders. Some writers have also implicated Gloucester in the death of Prince Edward of Lancaster, as we have seen. Within a month of this, the Duke had assisted in the murder of Henry VI. Whether he struck the fatal blow or not, Gloucester, at the impressionable age of 18, must have learned from this a useful lesson about the advantages of political murder, and would have been shown a clear precedent for the elimination of a king by violence. Richard of Gloucester was typical of the magnates of the period. Acquisitive, hungry for wealth, land and power, brave in battle, tough, ruthless, energetic, and keenly interested in warfare, heraldry, and the many pursuits such as hunting and hawking. He was staunchly loyal to the king and to his own supporters and followers, but did not scruple to ride roughshod over the rights of other people. Ambition drove him. Mancini, writing in 1483, says that from the first there were those who were not unaware of his ambition and cunning, and who had misgivings about where they would lead. Gloucester also courted popularity, and worked hard all his adult life to win it. He was an able man, and had some good qualities. He was hard-working and conscientious in his duties. He also had that in him that inspired the loyalty of others, and his fair share of the charisma of the Plantagenets. Croyland states he had a quick, alert, and overweening mind, that he was courageous and daring, and that he had a sharp wit and courage, high and fierce. In his youth, he was amorous. He acknowledged 2 bastards who were probably born before 1472. One was John of Pontefract, or of Gloucester, knighted in 1483, who was still under age in 1485 when his father appointed him captain of Calais, calling him our dear son, whose quickness of mind and agility of body and inclination to all good customs give us great hope of his good service for the future. The other was Catherine, who was generously dowered by Richard when she married William Herbert, Earl of Huntingdon, in 1484. A mysterious Richard Plantagenet of Eastwell in Kent, of whom more will be heard later, is also thought to have been a bastard son of Richard's, and there may have been 4 others, including one Stephen Hawes, but the evidence for these is unreliable. Conflicting descriptions of Richard left by his contemporaries have given rise to yet another controversy surrounding him. What did he look like? The consensus of opinion was that, unlike Edward IV and Clarence, he resembled his father, being dark-haired and short of stature. This lack of height is attested to by most writers, as is the slightness of his body. The Scots envoy, Archibald Whitelaw, who saw Richard in 1484, noted he had such a small body, while the Silesian knight Nicholas von Popilau, who also met Richard that year, commented on how lean he was. Later, John Roos would sneer at his little body and feeble strength, while Virgil, whose description was said to be based on the testimony of those who had known Richard, said he was deformed. It is this question of deformity that has long puzzled historians. In Richard's lifetime, no writer made reference to any. Croyland, Commonings, and the Great Chronicle make no mention of deformity. Neither do the 2 earlier eyewitnesses, Whitelaw and von Popilau. The Elizabethan antiquarian John Stowe told Sir George Buck he had spoken with old and grave men who had often seen Richard, and they had affirmed he was not deformed, but of person and bodily shape comely enough, which is slightly at variance with the eyewitnesses' reports. In 1491, moreover, York civic records record that in the course of a fight, a schoolmaster called John Paintor called Richard a crouchback, the first instance of him being referred to by what later became a popular nickname. Richard had often been in York and was well known there. Perhaps Master Paintor was merely being provocative, but it is quite possible that he had seen Richard and knew there was no longer any need for tact. As the Tudor period drew on, so the legend of the deformed king was elaborated upon. Roos, writing before 1490, stated that he had unequal shoulders, the right higher and the left lower, and a humped back. In Virgil's account, it is the left shoulder that is higher than the right. More, who also claimed one shoulder was higher than the other, echoed Virgil. The eyewitness, von Popilau, wrote of Richard's delicate arms and limbs. By Moore's time, it was believed that he had been ill-featured of limbs and crookback, with a shriveled, withered arm. To contemporary eyes, physical deformity was the outward manifestation of evil character. Thus, portraits of Richard, held to have been painted with the aim of flattering him, were altered in Tudor times to reflect what people believed he had really looked like. The earliest representation of him is the line drawing by John Rous in the First York Roll, which shows no deformity. Then there are 3 portrait types, of which several versions exist. The earliest is in the collection of the Society of Antiquaries of London. A masterful and evidently faithful copy of an original believed to have been from life, which has been tree ring dated to 1516 to 1522. In this, Richard has no apparent deformity. The second portrait type is that in the Royal Collection, which has been tree dated to 1518 to 1523. This is the most important of the tree. This is the most important of the 3, as it was the one on display in the royal palaces, which is probably why it is radically altered. X-rays taken in the 1950s and 1973 show that the right shoulder has been overpainted above the still visible original shoulder line by a later hand, and that the eyes have been narrowed. About 30 copies of this portrait are in existence, including that in the National Portrait Gallery, and all show the added deformities. The third likeness is also in the collection of the Society of Antiquaries and is entitled The Broken Sword Portrait. This has been tree ring dated to 1533 to 1543. Again, X-rays show drastic alterations. The portrait originally had a much raised left shoulder and deformed left arm, but in the 17th or 18th centuries, it was altered to show Richard with a more normal appearance. A copy of this portrait, unaltered and showing the left arm ending in a stump, was sold in 1921 in Brussels to a private collector. Richard's face in his portraits matches the descriptions given by Rous and Virgil, the latter writing that he had a short and sour countenance, and also Moore, who said he was hard-featured of visage. It is a stern face with cold eyes and a thin-lipped, tightly pursed mouth, a portrait of a man looking older than his years. So what was the truth about Richard's appearance? It would appear that he did have some slight deformity which eyewitnesses either did not notice or were too tactful to refer to overtly. It is possible that he suffered a mild form of Sprengel's deformity, or underdevelopment of the right or left scapula, leading to inefficient flexing of the shoulder muscles. There must, after all, have been some grain of truth in what the early Tudor chronicles wrote, for there were many people still alive who could have pointed out any gross anomalies in their works, people who remembered Richard well. Nevertheless, as memories faded and the years passed, the truth became more distorted, until by 1534 it was generally accepted that he had been a villainous hunchback with a withered arm, and there were then few of his contemporaries still alive to pour scorn on such nonsense. In 1471, Gloucester and Clarence were reconciled to each other, but not for long. In Clarence's household lived his wife's younger sister, Anne Neville, who, with Isabella, was co-heiress to their father, the late Earl of Warwick. Warwick had not been attainted, and his titles and estates should therefore have passed to his widow, Anne Beauchamp, who was entitled to a third share, and to his 2 daughters, the remainder being divided equally between them. But Edward IV had seized control of the Warwick inheritance and divided it up, giving some lands and offices to Clarence in right of his wife, and some to Gloucester, whilst ignoring the rights of the Dowager Countess. Clarence, who had received the lion's share, felt he should have all, and was therefore mortified when in 1471 Richard made it plain that he wanted to marry Anne Neville and claim half of her patrimony. This, wrote Croyland, did not suit the plans of the Duke of Clarence, since he feared a division of the Earl's property. He knew very well that marriage to Anne would entitle Richard to half the Warwick inheritance, and this made him determined to prevent the marriage. In consequence of this, violent dissensions arose between the brothers. Anne Neville was then 15. She had been briefly married, almost certainly in name only, to Prince Edward of Lancaster, and since his death she had been living in Clarence's great London house, the Erber in Downegate Street, near the Thames. In presence, she was seemly, amiable, and beauteous, and in conditions full, commendable, and right virtuous, and according to the interpretation of Anne, her name, full gracious, wrote Ruse, who revered Anne as Warwick's daughter. There is a drawing of her in royal heraldic robes in the Ruse roll, which shows a slender woman with long fair hair. Richard had known Anne in youth at Middleham, and the Flemish chronicler, Majerus, claims he became close to her then, yet his motive for marrying her was not so much love as the desire to acquire her lands. Neither Richard nor Clarence would show any regard at any time for the vociferously voiced claims of the Countess of Warwick, who had been illegally deprived by the king of her dower. To men like these, she simply did not count. Croyland tells us that Clarence was so determined that Gloucester should not marry Anne Neville that he caused the damsel to be concealed in order that it might not be known by his brother where she was. Still, however, the craftiness of the Duke of Gloucester so far prevailed that, having discovered the girl dressed as a kitchen maid in London, he had her moved to the sanctuary of St. Martin's near Newgate. Clarence demanded that Anne be returned to his house, but he was not her legal guardian and was powerless to prevent Richard from placing her in the care of her uncle and Archbishop of York. At last, wrote Croyland, their most loving brother, the king, agreed to act as mediator, and the whole misunderstanding was set to rest. A private war, however, had only just been averted. A seething Clarence had to agree to the carving up of the Warwick estates, even though he received the greater share of them and was created Earl of Warwick and Salisbury in right of his wife. Gloucester, in turn, was on marriage to receive Warwick's estates in Yorkshire, Northumberland, and Cumberland, where he would inherit the loyalty and service of those who had served the Nevilles. Richard and Anne were married in the summer of 1472 at Westminster, either in the Abbey or in St. Stephen's Chapel. Richard was so anxious for the marriage to go forward that he did not wait for a papal dispensation, which was necessary, as he and Anne were second cousins. After the wedding, the couple lived chiefly at Middleham Castle, a massive 11th century stronghold on high ground overlooking the river Weir in Yorkshire, which had been previously owned and enlarged by the Nevilles. Although primarily built for defense, the castle was in Richard's day extremely comfortable, with luxurious private apartments, fireplaces in the domestic ranges, and communal latrines. The Duke himself built a new great hall with spacious windows above the old keep. There was a chapel and plenty of accommodation for the many scores of retainers a royal duke needed in his retinue. Middleham is now in ruin, but enough remains to give a good impression of the splendor that once earned it the name the Windsor of the North. We know nothing at all about Richard and Anne's personal life, nor whether they were happily or unhappily married, nor what they felt about each other. Anne's health seems to have been delicate, and they had one child only, named Edward of Middleham, after the place of his birth, who was probably born in the spring of 1476. As Roos states, he was 7½ in August 1483. He seems to have been a frail boy, as he rarely left Middleham, where he was nursed as a baby by one Jane Collins, who earned £100 per annum, and he was later tutored by a Master Richard Burnell. In the summer of 1473, Gloucester arranged for his mother-in-law, the Countess of Warwick, to join the household at Middleham. This unfortunate lady, still in her 40s, had been living in the sanctuary at Bullock Abbey in Hampshire since Warwick's death, occupying herself by sending urgent petitions for the restoration of her lands to the king, the queen, the king's mother, the Duchess of York, and even the young Princess Elizabeth, but to no avail. On the 13th of June, 1473, the Paston letters record that the Countess is now out of Belleau Sanctuary, and Sir James Tyrrell conveyeth her northward men, say by the king's assent. Tyrrell was one of Richard's most trusted retainers. Roos later stated that the Countess had fled to Gloucester as her chief refuge, only to find herself locked up for the duration of his life. As Roos had always taken such a particular interest in the Beauchamp and Neville families, and made it his business to record their deeds, it is quite possible that this was the Countess's fate. Certainly, she made no public appearances after this time. Indeed, both Gloucester and Clarence were instrumental in bringing about the passing in 1474 of an Act of Parliament settling all of the Warwick estates upon themselves in right of their spouses, and ignoring the rights of the Dowager Countess, who was deemed to be naturally and legally dead. Gloucester had now learned another valuable political lesson, that Parliament could be manipulated to pass legislation that took no account of the principles of established law. Yeah. Chew on that factoid.